I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for coming today. So what I want to talk about today, I want to first talk about the model and the approach through which myself and my organization, we approach public art projects, and really also talk about the values, what we think about the who, the what, the when. So first is I'm an artist, and I also run a national organization named Culture Strike, and our goal is to leverage art and culture to shift the national imagination on immigration. As you all may very well be aware, we live in a very hostile anti-migrant climate. It's a global anti-migrant climate, and the goal of the organization is to look at how we can shift over the next 10, 20 years to a more open, pro-migrant, inviting culture. So how do we approach the work? Well, first is the recognition that we live in times of extreme cultural inequity, right? The pipeline of artists is broken. So if you look at the data at a national level, 4 out of 5 working artists are white, and the average median income of an artist is $30,000. The top universities, the most expensive universities in the country that don't offer scholarships are art schools. And in the regions like LA Unified, even here in Oakland Unified, the regions with most kids of color are the regions where arts programs are being cut. And if we look across the sector, whether it's the performing arts, the visual arts, television, pop culture, the issue of diversity, I mean, we're looking at sectors where you have 98% white critics, okay, and at all levels, literature. And so what does this mean? It means that when we look at art and art making, we have to understand that we are in a landscape of vast and extreme inequality, and not just around who gets to make the art, but that we are creating a culture that is really reflective of one narrative, and that the culture that surrounds us all, whether what you're watching on TV, the shows you choose to watch, the food you choose to eat, all of that is embedded with values. And so we have to think about who is producing these things, how, in a lot of ways, our laws, the way that we vote, immigration policy, incarceration policy, food policy, is very much influenced by the culture around us, right? And so when we wonder why we have to say Black Lives Matter, well, let's look at the culture where you have hardly any books with Black characters. You have hardly children's books with Black characters. In fact, the way that Black people, Latinos are shown is extremely stereotypical. It's racist. And so what we do at Culture Strike is look at a larger strategy around who's creating culture and how do we create a culture that really builds power. And so there's 3 pillars. When we talk about cultural equity, there's 3 pillars: power, representation, and access, right? So just because you have a show with a diverse staff, that doesn't mean that we really have power, because at the end of the day, we're still being deported, we're still being in prison, and just because you have, you may have a diverse looking group, it doesn't mean that we have access, right? And so 3 things to think about: power, representation, and access. The other thing is that we live in times of vibrant social movements, and that we have to think about how do we build power in collaboration with social movements, and especially when it comes to racial justice, immigrant rights. These movements are very robust, and they're growing. And they are a force to be reckoned with, especially in our cultural space. I mean, if you look at the impact of Black Lives Matter in pop culture, the way that sports people, actors, Prince is responding to a call that's coming from the bottom up. And so we think about what is this intersection between art and social movements, and how do we create cultural and creative practices that allow movement leaders to become artists and to integrate art practices, and then also bring more artists into our ranks, right? Address cultural inequality. And through the creation of interventions, how do we feed a larger cultural shift, which is basically how do we reprogram people to move away from being anti-migrant and really challenge the implicit bias. So I'm going to walk you through 3 case studies. So let's think about immigration in particular. How many people know what year was the last time we had immigration reform in this country? 1986. It's been 30 years. Reagan was the last president to legalize people, he legalized 2.3 million undocumented migrants. Today we have 11 million undocumented people in this country. Immigrants make up the fastest growing prison population. And Obama just decided to stop contracting with private prisons. Well, private prisons are running immigration detention centers. Another thing to note is every day there's 1,100 deportations, every single day. I mean, Obama really broke the record when it came to deportation. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, how did we get into this climate? Well, it started here in the 90s. Pete Wilson, the governor, was the first governor to introduce an anti-migrant state-based legislation, and he began to use the word illegal, illegal, illegal. If you think about the word illegal, it's really this kind of thing in the imagination where it's a emphasis on criminality, right? And we've been now dealing with over 20 years of the impacts of what happens when you have a culture that promotes illegality, right? That it's a very hateful culture, it's a very racialized culture. And so let's also think about the border. Well, the US-Mexico border in the minds of the collective American imagination represents law. It represents law and order. Never mind that crossings have actually gone down, right? The border is one of the most heavily militarized zones in the world. And anytime anyone talks about immigration reform, what happens? Oh, you have senators attach on huge budgets. I mean, even what Trump is talking about, you can't militarize the border anymore. But somehow the border stands in the way of immigration reform. It is a metaphor that we have to really break. And so this project, Migration is Beautiful, was an attempt for people to reimagine that migration is a human right. We've been migrating since the beginning of time. We migrated from Africa. Animals migrate. Migration is a part of life. And so the monarch butterfly, which migrates from the US, Mexico, and Canada, is a metaphor for us to imagine a world without borders. And this metaphor, we create into activities, wearable costumes, poster making, and it's now been very vibrant throughout the immigration rights space for about 4 years, and just totally expanded. I actually just came back from Burning Man, where we made 500 of these with burners in the desert, and really using it as an opportunity to talk about inclusion, right? I think also in our social justice movements, we're really good at talking about what we're against, but we're not good at talking about the vision for the future, right? We're not the yes people, we're the no people. And so part of, for me, the power of artists is that we're visionaries. We can help people with imagine, right, the kind of world that they want to build. And so these metaphors are really meant for people to make a statement, but also to reflect values. It's values-based, right? And so this is the NEA, the National Education Association, adopted the symbol, and they made posters that they distributed to their 10,000 member teachers throughout the country as a way to say, just like the pink triangle, dreamers, undocumented youth, you're welcome here. We're not going to let ICE come and take you, because previously ICE would go into school districts, even here in Oakland, and take kids. ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement. I mean, the image really circulated well. This is Senator Joaquin Castro's door. And then also last year in Wisconsin, when they were trying to pass a law that was similar to Arizona's SB 1070, people, again, mobilized around positive messaging, right? Because I think, and Black Lives Matter is such a great example of this, is that, we're not demanding a policy shift, we're demanding a new way of thinking. We're asking for you to imagine a world where Black Lives Matter, and what that means is that we show up for Black people. We stand up to these crooked, OPDs. We even question, do we need these racist police in our neighborhoods, right? That's our role of artists, is to present the impossible and to really say, we can go there. We can dream big and go there. So the next project I want to talk about, the second one, is called Visions from the Inside. So if you Google immigration detention centers, this is what you see. And the overwhelming amount of photos have come from the right wing, right? Breitbart News, for example, one of the worst anti-immigrant outlets, leaked photos of immigration detention centers. You all probably have seen these. But what do you see here? Well, you see overcrowded prisons, right? And they're very negative. These pictures are dehumanizing. And so when we think about migrants, right, what goes off in your head? People running across the border, people stuck in immigration detention centers. So how do we challenge this thinking? Well, first is that immigration detention centers are on the rise. Again, migrants make up the fastest growing federal prison population. It's a really lucrative business, and the prison industry knows that. And so how do we get these voices out? Especially, right now we're in a national conversation around mass incarceration. We have to include migrants in that conversation because migrants are often highly invisibilized, and that works in the benefit of isolating them. I'm not sure if you all know this, but overwhelmingly in the Texas border especially, the people being incarcerated are women and their kids, their teenage kids. And so just last month, I think it was, in Berks, you had women and their teenager kids go on a hunger strike to say, we don't want to live like this. We'd rather die than continue in isolation. So we learned that the best way to get voices is through letter writing, because it's very hard to get phone cards in these detention centers, and because they're privately run, it's very hard to do visitation programs. And so with letters, we commissioned about 15 artists to begin writing to people in detention centers and to develop works with the bigger idea that we would then circulate these works through different press outlets around the country, but also to the UN Commission on Migrant Affairs, different pro-migrant organizations, and get the stories out of the mothers, especially the mothers in detention. So here's an example of two artists, Zeke, Pena, and Dali. We ended up securing about 30 outlets, who began to repost this, and including, a cover story on the East Bay Express, BuzzFeed, different articles that then began to talk about who these women were. And then here in Oakland, we did a hands-on workshop to enlarge these images, because these images were co-created with some of the moms in detention centers. And then we began to understand, a lot of these folks in detention centers, they want to be written to. So we helped facilitate, we built a website with Forward Together and presente.org to facilitate letter writing for Mother's Day. And so we gathered 5,000 letters from people around the country, and they were in English and Spanish, and helped organize protests at detention centers, and then sent the letters to about 16 detention centers through visitation programs, right? Because there's no other way to get the letters in than by people actually visiting. So the impact of this is really thinking about how it's not just about the creation of the work, but it's also about how you get the work into the hands of the right people, and that you are able to leverage the work to have a larger impact, whether it's through press or whether it's through just some kind of high visibility action that also incorporates the movement groups. And finally, the last project is Until We're All Free. And so two of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, they also work in the immigrant rights sector. And so the call that they have made is that how do we, as immigrant communities, really address our anti-Blackness? And those of you who grew up in Latino households, in non-Black Latino households, or in Asian households, you probably are well aware of how migrant communities have often been pitted against Black communities. And so this project is around really addressing anti-Blackness through curriculum, through racial justice curriculum. And we are about to publish these art and story sessions, which use art as a way for us to first, talk about our biases or fears, but then also to talk about our shared experiences, right? That, all of us have migrated. We, in many ways, this artificial black and white narrative invisibilizes so many of us. And that how do we really stand up for Black lives? The moment is now. And so really, leveraging art to have these very, very difficult conversations. So that's it. We'll open it up to questions in the panel. Thank you so much.